Hello, welcome back. I'm Brad Cornell, Emeritus Professor of Finance at the Anderson Graduate School of Management at UCLA, and author of the book, Global Climate Change, the Pragmatic Guide to Moving the Needle with Ivo Welsh. And this session is going to be one of the most controversial. So far, my series of videos have been about analytic methods and climate change data, and that was a big focus of our book, and I think that's very important. This one is about what we should do about it, and that is much more controversial. And Professor Welsh and I are particularly controversial because we don't think the standard approaches are going to be successful. So let's review the fundamental problem of climate change, and that is that it's the mother of all externalities, as Bill Nordhaus said. What's an externality? An externality is a situation where the economic activity undertaken by one person affects other people, but the original actor doesn't take those effects into account. The most common example of this is the so-called tragedy of the commons, which comes from the 18th century. The commons was an open area in a community where there was grass growing and so forth, and people could bring their sheep there to graze. But in bringing their sheep, each individual farmer only took account of the cost of rounding up his sheep and taking them down to the commons, not the costs imposed on others by the fact that his sheep ate the grass. And this became known as the tragedy of the commons because the grass became overgrazed and it was not available either for public enjoyment or for other sheep. And this problem is extraordinarily common. In our book, Professor Welsh and I did a little example with water. When the short-term self-interest leads to a tragedy for all, that's the tragedy of the commons. And here's an example. The people on the left say water belongs to anyone. I can take as much as I want. But the guy on the right finds there seems to be less and less these days. The people on the left are not taking account of the people on the right. And when it comes to climate change, the release of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly CO2, is, like Professor Nordhaus says, the mother of all externalities. And let me give you an example of how extreme it could be. This is a calculation for Bangladesh. And in 2021, the world in its energy production and usage released 33,884,000,000 gigatons, million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. Of that, Bangladesh emitted 100 million, or 0.3%. So suppose that Bangladesh is considering building a coal-fired power plant. If they do so, they will get 100% of the benefits of that coal-fired plant. But they will only pay 0.3% or so of the emissions costs. The rest will be spread around the world and shared with everybody. And this is an example, an extreme example, of the tragedy of the commons applied to climate change. And you can see it writ large when you look at things like coal plants. Coal electric generation plants are one of the biggest sources of greenhouse gases. The yellow dots in this chart are where the coal plants are currently operating. The pink dots are where coal plants are planned. And you can see in the most populated and developing parts of the world, including Bangladesh, citizens and governments are planning coal plants because the private benefits to them simply outweigh the private costs that they bear. Most of those costs are shared worldwide with everybody else. The same is true of oil refineries. Oil refineries are still being rapidly developed in Asia and parts of Europe, though not North America or Oceania. Once again, parties are putting their own private interests first, and this is not surprising. Having reliable, low-cost energy is critical for a modern economy. And while citizens of the world would like to have less climate change, they would not like to have it at the expense of reliable, low-cost energy. So, how do you overcome this? Well, one way that people have suggested is to have international agreements. We've had a host of so-called conferences of the parties, which are abbreviated simply COP. We just had one in Egypt. Last year there was one in Glasgow. There was a famous one in Paris. In all these COP meetings, leaders from around the world jet in, incidentally at very high emissions costs, often on private jets, to try to plan what we're going to do and to reach agreements for global climate change. Well, Ivo and I think these things are going to fail and have failed. There's no way to police them. There's no agreement on what should be done. And the poorer countries that want to develop are saying that if we forego coal and oil and fossil fuels for our development, you better pay us for it. And the rich countries are backtracking on that. They'll say, we'll pay you something, but nothing like what you want, and so forth. In our view, this is just going to continue. There are not going to be successful agreements to limit emissions based on moral arguments and international politics. So what do we do then? Well, what Ivo and I believe we need to do is subsidize research. Subsidize it in a big way. Research has two externalities too, but they're positive. The first externality, which applies to all basic research, is that the parties doing the basic research don't get all the benefits, but pay all the costs. If my company develops a vaccine, the benefits of that vaccine may be spread among billions of people, but I'm not going to get all the benefit. However, if I was developing the vaccine, I paid all the costs. So there's this huge disincentive from engaging in basic research, and that has to be overcome. Professor Welch and I believe that we need massive subsidies for fundamental research related to energy provision and climate change, and that's the critical input. And there's a second externality. The first externality is that people doing basic research generally don't get the full benefits of it. But the second is if they're doing climate-related basic research, they don't get any of the climate benefits. If an American does research, it benefits the Chinese as much as it does the Americans with respect to global climate change. So what countries need to be doing, and particularly the rich developed countries, is making a massive effort in the climate change area. And there's reason to be optimistic here. For example, this is the cost of electricity generation predicted for both 2026 and 2050. And if you look at this carefully, you can see that wind and solar are already the cheapest sources of energy. So the problem is not being able to generate the electricity. The problem, as we'll see in a second, is being able to store it and use it reliably. But there's every reason to believe that technology could be the way out of our dilemma. That we don't want to ask developing countries to forego coal plants because it's immoral or it hurts the rich countries or we're going to have an agreement. We want them to forego coal plants because they're more expensive. In that case, there's no reason to have to ask them to do so. They will do so in their own self-interest. No one had to ask people to switch from landlines to cell phones when Apple introduced the iPhone. It became clear that that was in their interest. So as of now, it looks like renewable sources of energy will become sufficiently cheap that they could be adopted on their own basis. But storage is the big problem. Lithium-ion batteries and pumped hydro and all cost a lot to store energy. And when you add those costs to the generation costs, then fossil fuel-based electricity generation can still be superior. And that is why you see all those pink dots in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa with regard to the construction of coal plants. So, what type of innovation are we talking about? And this list can be long. I want to just give you the key ones that we put in the book. And incidentally, this whole topic of why the negotiations will fail, why innovation is the key, and what type of innovation is discussed in detail in the book. And I highly recommend it. But here are some of the key areas that we think is ripe excuse me, for future research. First, electrical storage. Modern societies have to have reliable, low-cost energy. And for that to be provided by renewable sources, we need more and better storage. Second, that storage can be limited if we can extend the electrical grid and add intelligence and reform regulation and make it national in every country so that the people optimally respond to the costs and benefits of using electricity. If we have better pricing, if we have more intelligent movement of electricity around the country, that will require less storage. Third, we need research into the electrification of industrial processes, such as the making of steel and cement. That currently is a big source of CO2, and we need to get around that. Fourth, nuclear power, including small reactors and maybe even fusion, has got to be part of the story. Nuclear power is an emission-free, 24-hour-a-day source of electricity. Green hydrogen will no doubt play a part. As electricity gets cheaper from renewable sources, that electricity can be used to electrolyze water and make what is called green hydrogen. That green hydrogen can then be a substitute for fossil fuels, including in industrial processes. Solar engineering is a bit scary. What this is shooting materials into the atmosphere to block some of the sun's radiation and thereby reduce warming. The fact is, it's by far the cheapest way to respond to global warming, but it may well be the scariest. But it could become less scary if we continue to do intelligent research in that area. Carbon capture currently is too expensive. Maybe research can find a way to do it cheaper. If it could, it allows us to use fossil fuels for things like making steel and cement without having a net input into atmospheric concentration of CO2. Finally, adaptation has got to be part of the story. Talked about this earlier with regard to Professor Pindick's book, which I show again here. this entire book is about adaptation, which Professor Welch and I don't discuss as much, but it's got to be part of the story. There's got to be an optimal trade-off between the amount of warming we allow because of the benefits of using the fossil fuels. And adaptation has got to be a key part of that story. You can look back at the video on integrated assessment models for a discussion of the role of adaptation. So where do Professor Welch and I come out in all of this? First, we believe that international meetings and negotiations are likely to largely fail. Countries are basically going to pursue their own self-interest. There's just no way around that. Second, finger pointing such as condemning fossil fuel companies and moral arguments are a distraction. People will demand reasonably priced, reliable energy, and they will do so even if it involves accepting climate change. When push comes to shove, people are not going to freeze in their homes or fail to drive their cars. We've got to have the reliable, low-cost energy. We conclude that the key is massive increase in fundamental research related to energy provision and its environmental impact. It just has to become cheap to be green. And as I said earlier, no one had to be forced to replace their landline with an iPhone. So in our view, in some sense, technology got us into this problem. It allowed for the massive increase in human population. It allowed for the massive economic development in at least parts of the world. It's provided a lifestyle that royalty could not have dreamed of 3 or 4 centuries ago. All that's wonderful, but it's also provided external costs, of which climate change is the mother of all externalities. And we have to deal with it now. But in our view, technology, which was the way in, is also the way out. We think that renewable sources of energy, if wisely developed, can be a solution to the problem. But the solution is going to require massive amounts of continued basic research, and that needs to be subsidized in the wealthy countries. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you have a chance to pick up our book at Amazon and follow these topics in greater detail. Thanks. Bye.